Hello and welcome back to Starmergeddon, TLDR's official podcast. I'm Jack and today I'm joined by Rory Taylor.
Hello.
And Ben Blissett.
Hello.
How are you doing?
Good.
Very good, yeah.
Anything exciting happened? Been a while since Rory's been on the podcast.
I think it's my first time on the official Starmergeddon branded
Whoa.
podcast. So,
how's it feel?
not too different so far, but we'll see where we go.
We might
Wait till you see
Yeah.
the change of tone on this podcast.
I know, it's going to be crazy.
So different.
I have been tuning in though while I've not been.
Have you?
Yeah, don't worry.
You been enjoying it?
I've read it a lot, yeah, it's great. And the editorial as well.
Oh, the editorial is actually doing better right now. The editorial is the TLDR's lead
Yeah.
podcast.
We don't discuss the editorial.
I'm going to actually stop calling this the official TLDR podcast.
The editorial is the
Soon.
official one. Yeah.
In today's episode, we're going to be talking about various issues which emerged at PMQs this week. Obviously, we've got Parliament back. We've got Rishi Sunak back, weirdly. Everyone kind of forgot he was still there, but he turned up. Very nice of him to show. And the two issues we want to talk about are...
The arms embargo to Israel, well, not quite embargo, but it's just the suspension of arms licenses to Israel.
Yeah.
And then also winter fuel payments, because the sort of backlash and fallout from the decision to means test the winter fuel payments is still happening and was highlighted in PMQs.
There we go. Before we get to either of those things, though, I'd like to very quickly shout out our new posters. I know, exciting.
Yeah.
Whoa, a little round of applause.
Yeah.
Very quiet one. When we're done with this
Imperceptible.
section, I want a loud round of applause. These are our new posters. This is the Every Major Global Alliance Explained poster designed by me and Rory.
It's great.
And it contains basically every country in the world, maybe even literally every country in the
Yeah,
world.
should be literally.
And all of the major alliances they're part of, which are these different coloured sections. And the idea is, while it might not be the most educational tool, it is a cool way of visualising how the world works, how different countries fit together. And it's just a cool bit of TLDR you can have. There's also, pass them down if you want.
Thank you.
There's also this variant,
Get to keep it.
which is similar. You can't, you can keep it if you want. There's this version, which is similar, but has colourful lines with different colours indicating different continents. And there's this version, which is just a ton of different colours.
Chaos.
And it's maybe the easiest one to read, but it's probably the kind of most chaotic one. So it depends which one you like most. They're all available on the store, and all of them you can get for 20% off by using code... 20%, no, by using code podcastposter. That's all one word. That code will only be active for a while, so if you do want one and you want 20% off, which is a huge discount, you can obviously look more closely on the website. That's toolong.news, and you can look more closely at the poster. You can inspect it to your heart's content. But if you use the code, we'll know you came from the podcast, and you'll support the continuation of the podcast for weeks and months and years to come.
Wow. Good commitment. Can I give you that back?
You can give me that back.
I'll buy my own version, don't worry. Yeah.
Speaking of alliances and agreements and international deals, obviously, as we mentioned, one of the major things that came up was trade with Israel and the UK's support of Israel in the ongoing war in Gaza. So that was a contentious moment at PMQs today. It was certainly a much discussed moment. But before we get to the kind of the controversy and the discussion around it, could we outline what the UK's position was and what it is now?
Yeah, so since October 7th and the start and the continuation of the war in Gaza, the UK government has been diplomatically supportive of Israel. But as time has gone on, it has been more critical of Israel, the way Israel's prosecuting the war, as the number of casualties grows and scrutiny on sort of Israel's practices.
Yeah.
Alleged breaches of international humanitarian law and so on. But the UK continued to supply Israel with military hardware, not direct from the government, but UK companies would sell parts of weaponry and ammunition and that type of thing to Israel. And these are covered by arms export licenses. So licenses have to be granted by the government for companies to sell parts and stuff. So the big debate was, should the UK continue doing that, or should the UK stop sending weapons? Should the UK government stop allowing British companies to send weapons and parts of weapons to Israel in order to try and get them to comply with international humanitarian law? So for months, the previous government had been talking about getting legal advice. They'd kind of been, I think it's basically established now, they had been sitting on legal advice and hadn't made a decision. about what to do. So effectively, these licenses continued. Labour came in, asked for new legal advice. How many months are we from the election now? Two months on. They finally sort of set out the advice they got and what they're going to do with it. So the headline is, the UK is suspending some, but not all, of the arms exports licenses to Israel. So it's going to be 30 of 350, which is obviously less than 10% of them. It doesn't sound like a huge amount. And there's also going to be an exemption for the F-35 program, which is a global fighter jet program that the UK plays quite an important role in. So that's the big announcement. It is long awaited and now the subject of much debate, as expected.
And you can sort of see why a debate has been caused here, because the argument from the Labour government was that it was purely like a legal matter. Like this, they've been trying to portray it as like it's not a political decision. We've received legal advice and we're doing this to try and prevent the use of certain military equipment in some of the actions that Israel are taking that might fall foul of international law. So that is the sort of position. And you can kind of see how both sides would be frustrated by this, because for people that want the new Labour government to show more support for Palestinians, you can sort of see why, as you say, it's less than 10%.
Yeah, it's a relatively small
so 30 of the 350 licenses. So the majority is still, the UK companies can still export, many UK companies can still export weapons to Israel. But you can also see why Rishi Sunak, who is trying to push the current government to be more supportive of Israel, is frustrated with this, because just the fact that any export licenses have been sort of restricted at all. So you can sort of see where this debate happens. And I suppose the interesting thing is going to be over the next few months, whether more and more sort of arms licenses are sort of rescinded or restricted, or whether this is the furthest that they go. Like, it'll be interesting to see which route Labour go down, because like the previous government, it's sort of, they're trying to walk this line between two different groups, and they're getting criticised from both sides.
And they have made clear that this is an ongoing process. It's not like we've had the legal advice, we've made the decision, it's done. It's ever changing, because obviously the situation in Gaza is always changing. It's worth pointing out, and this is kind of part of quite a lot of the debate, that the UK's arms supplies to Israel are pretty minimal on a global scale. That's largely because the US just absolutely dominates that. So the US just recently approved another $20 billion of military aid to Israel, which is massive. So the question isn't, I think everyone, on whatever you think of it, everyone agrees that this won't have a massive impact on Israel's sort of military capability, but it's more about moral and legal. It's more of a moral and legal question, effectively. I can go on.
Keep going, please.
Like Ben said, it's an interesting one, because Labour have been sort of trying to work out what they're going to do for 2 months now, and it seems like they've kind of come to a position which has pleased basically no one. You've got on one side the chief rabbi of the UK, for example, and the board of deputies of British Jews, very influential Jewish groups and people in this country, have quite heavily criticised the Labour government. One of the things they've said is about the timing of the announcement, and because it came a day or two after these 6 Israeli hostages were killed by Hamas, or at least the bodies were recovered. And that is unfortunate timing, but the announcement was made on the first day that Parliament came back. And also, this is a particularly brutal war. There isn't going to be a single day where that announcement would come after a week of nothing, effectively.
Exactly.
So that's on one side. And also, Israel itself has been incredibly critical.
Of course.
Benjamin Netanyahu was really angry. He even sort of invoked the Second World War and likened his government to the British government fighting against the Nazis in the Second World War. So it's obviously quite heavily strained the UK and Israel relationship.
It's also strained, obviously, the UK and the US relationship slightly. Because obviously the US, as you've already said, provides a ridiculous amount of support to Israel and wants the UK to continue supplying arms in the way that the US is, obviously. And it's quite interesting to see how this will impact the UK and the US relationship. I mean, obviously it comes at a time where we're only months away from a US presidential election in which Biden will not be the president next year. You know, obviously he's not running anymore. So I suppose the UK might have felt ever so slightly emboldened to make a stand independently of the US, because they know that it's not going to, if it does strain a relationship with Biden, he's not going to be there long anyway.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But as I said, as Rory's already sort of pointed out, this is an ongoing process. So it'll be interesting to see whether more export licenses are, rescinded or restricted or something in the next few months, especially when there is a new president, and how that impacts things.
Rishi Sunak said something in PMQs that he basically criticised the decision and said that the government must avoid any perception of splits between our two nations, referring to the UK and US. I think that's quite an interesting quote, because it's effectively saying we shouldn't have any independence.
Yeah, US foreign policy should be.
It's pretty weak, isn't it? Yeah. And if there was ever going to be a point of divide on foreign policy, it's got to be on an issue of such sort of like significance and importance as what's happening in Gaza. So I don't think. I
also find that
interesting.
Particularly interesting, because the Conservatives are usually the ones that really want to increase defence spending, and the argument they make is that we need to be able to sort of make our own decisions and sort of maintain sort of military power globally. And the fact that it's exactly that. What that means is we should do what the Americans tell us to, which obviously undermines any argument for increasing defence spending. That's been like one of their whole things, is like increasing the proportion of GDP that we spend on defence.
Because we want to be our own.
Because we want to be our own player in the world, and that's not being our own player in the world at all. That's just doing what another country tells us to. It's also why they always make the argument about Trident and increasing funding for Trident. Because yes, the US has tons of nukes, but their argument is we should have our own, so that we can maintain our influence abroad, and for defensive purposes. But
only when the US wants us to. We only need the influence and the nukes if Biden says we can.
But no chance of launching one of those unless the US has already done it, or says we can.
So obviously, Labour were trying to land a comfortable middle ground between these two sides, kind of delegating the decision to lawyers rather than it being political. Would we say that has you obviously say it's annoyed both sides, but would you say that strategy has fully failed? Is it that the strong feelings on either side, obviously they were never going to be happy, but like it has kind of towed a middle ground that's kept like most people happy? Or is it a case of like, this has just failed? This argument of it's not political, it's legal, it's not our fault, has just totally missed?
I suppose from Labour's perspective, they would say we weren't making this decision to please anyone. We were doing it to ensure that the British components weren't involved in breaches of international law. So they would say that what they've done is the best way of reaching that. Achieving that goal. And
who's happy doesn't matter.
But so I think it's interesting because, I mean, we talked about this sort of Israeli and pro-Israeli response. On the other side, you've got like pro-Palestinian groups and also human rights groups like Amnesty International have effectively said this is the bare minimum or this is insufficient. I think Amnesty said it's like riddled with loopholes or something like that. I think that was the quote they used, with the F-35 program being an example. But I don't know if if that response from both sides will make Labour think, right, we'll just leave it as it is, we won't do any more. Or whether they'll look at, for example, the Israeli response and think, wow, they're really upset with this. We're going to try and please them going forward. Or do they look at the Israeli response and think, well, this was a fairly, this wasn't, we didn't end it's not a total embargo. It's quite a partial one. And also they made pains to make clear how supportive they were of Israel in the announcement. Given the Israeli response, the Israelis' negative response, does the government now think, well, if they're going to respond like that to this, we may as well just, go further as far as we like. I don't think that is what they'll do. I think they'll probably try and stick with where they are, but it's an interesting thing to watch going forwards, I suppose.
Let's move on to the second contentious issue from PMQs then, that of winter fuel payments. Now, this is something we discussed in previous videos and podcasts, but again, could we have a quick TLDR on what the policy is, what the changes are, and why people are unhappy about it?
Yeah, so this was introduced by the Conservatives, and it's the idea that 10, 15 years ago, there was an issue with pensioner poverty in this country. And the winter fuel payment is just a way for the government to give money to pensioners to make sure that they can afford their heating through, obviously, the colder months. So it was a blanket payment. Usually, I mean, at the minute, it counts about £200-300 to pay for energy across winter.
£200-300 a year?
Yeah.
Okay.
Each winter for pensioners.
And that is just money paid into a bank account. That is not like a discount that's paid like explicitly towards your bill. That is just money you get.
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
entirely
That's
sure.
a good
Actually,
question.
that's a really good question. But I will look into that. I'll put my best man on it.
Okay, great.
But we'll circle back around. But yeah, so it's usually accounts about between £100 and £300. Now, obviously, the new Labour government's come in and they've explained that there is this big fiscal black hole, it's about £22 billion, and that we've got to find that money from somewhere. So one of the things that they've done is they've means tested the winter fuel payments, which means that you are only eligible to be paid the winter fuel payment if you're on other state mean tested benefits. So that means that only the poorest pensioners will now get this money rather than everyone.
Yeah.
Now, people who advocate for this, people who say that that is a fair move, will argue that without it being means tested would mean that it would go to very, very wealthy pensioners, people with multiple houses, and they don't need between £100 and £300 every year to pay for their heating. That is money the state is throwing away to people who do not need it. But obviously, other people will argue that only giving it to the most hard-off pensioners will mean that people on very, very low, who have very low savings, who are not being paid much as pensioners, will be forfeiting that and will find it very difficult to pay for their energy over the winter months.
Do we know what proportion of people will still receive it? Like,
I haven't seen any data on this, and I think it'll be difficult until we get closer.
I was just going to quickly answer the first question. It is just it's not cash, but it's a payment. You get the money. It's not like a voucher or anything.
Sure.
So it's for people who are on pension credit. So it would be whatever percentage of pensioners are on pension credit.
Okay.
Versus whatever percentage aren't. I don't know that percentage.
Okay.
But
Yeah. So I presume it's a relatively small amount in terms of the actual total number of pensioners. So there'll be a lot of people who previously were eligible for it and will no longer be. And this is sort of, this is the first week we're back after the summer recess. So this is the first time that we've actually seen this bubble up in the Commons. Obviously, we've seen a lot of debate about this in the media, and sort of Sunak's line on this was that Starmer has now resolved his negotiations with the unions, and he's handed quite large pay increases to particularly train drivers, which I think over 3 years, was it 20-something percent? So it was like a 5-4, oh no, I can't remember exactly what the numbers were, but it was a particularly large pay rise for train drivers. And Sunak is claiming that it's inflation busting. Obviously, depends when you're counting from, because they haven't been given an increase pay rise that's been above inflation for a number of years. So it's actually quite a complicated thing to sort of fact check per se. But they're saying that they're basically taking money away from pensioners who are not being paid very well to train drivers who they claim are being paid very well. So this is sort of like the first time we've seen this. And I think we're going to see this argument come up quite a lot in the next few months, especially when we get to this budget at the end of this month. I think it's going to be, we've already been told it's going to be a particularly hard budget. We've already been told there's this black hole. We know that the government's having to find money somewhere, and the government's going to have to either increase tax or reduce spending in certain places. And I think the Conservatives are really going to try and hammer Labour for this, and Labour's made clear that they don't want to tax working people. Been very, very clear, both in the election and since, that they're not going to increase income tax, they're not going to increase national insurance, and they're not going to increase VAT. So they're going to have to find that elsewhere, and anywhere else you look, it's groups that generally have supported the Conservatives. It could be corporation tax, businesses usually supporting the Conservatives. Obviously, it could be changing the triple lock, although there's been some speculation they're actually not going to do that now. So, but that would be pensioners who generally support the Conservatives. So I think this might be the start of quite a intense and quite long-running attack line from the Conservatives at Labour now that they're having to sort of find money.
And it's as we go into winter, it's only going to get more and more relevant. Because I think they must have announced this policy a little while ago, and obviously was talked about at the time, but it really feels like it's picking up steam, the debate over it. There's one thing I wanted to add. about why it's a controversial decision to cut it. I think it's something like 800,000 pensioners who are eligible for pension credit but aren't actually, who haven't signed up for it, who would then lose their winter fuel payment. So they're people who should qualify for it but won't. So that's a big challenge, is to make sure those people do sign up for pension credit and then do receive their...
What's the reason for that? Is that just...
I guess they just either aren't aware that they're eligible for it, or maybe they don't know how to do it.
It feels like a lot of people.
It is quite a lot. Yeah.
Like, how many pensioners can there be in the UK? Like 15 million, 20 million? That's like a good chunk of them.
I would say that that's not so much an argument against means testing it. That's an argument for increased awareness.
Making sure that people are.
Of people's eligibility. I would say that this is a situation where a lot of government provisions are means tested. The vast majority of sort of like money the government hands out is means tested and is sort of, it's not just given to everybody by virtue of age or by virtue of anything else. It's very much to do with, if you need it,
kind of makes sense.
The government gives you it, and that does make sense. Obviously, with anything like this, whenever there's a cut-off, the people close to that cut-off,
of course,
it is frustrating, and there will always be debate about where that should be. But I suppose with this, it doesn't sound like too many people are arguing about it being means tested per se. It's about the people that fall close to that line. All of the arguments the Conservatives have been using recently has been about, oh, well, there'll be people who are very poor, people who still need the winter fuel payments, but because of where that line is drawn, they're not eligible to, and that's unfair. So I've not heard many arguments saying that it should be available to all pensioners. It's always about those people that fall close to that line.
Yeah, because you could make the argument, I'm sure there are some people doing that, about universality, and and you could make this about other benefit programs, but that a universal program is better for, there's less bureaucracy trying to work out who's eligible or not. But the Conservatives, they're not making that argument, although they are sort of on that side, if that makes sense, within this debate. And then you've got Labour sort of arguing against the universality side of it, so it's slightly strange. But there was one I thought was quite amusing, that Labour pointed out that Kemi Badenoch had previously suggested means testing winter fuel payment. So it's this weird thing where Conservatives are saying, you shouldn't be doing this. Labour saying, well, actually, you wanted to do this, but you haven't done this. It's a lot of finger pointing.
Yeah,
really.
And I think this is what happens when you have a government that's been in for 14 years and you have such a divergent opinion within that governing party, that you will always have people who have suggested this at some point. Like 14 years is a long time, and you've got a lot of ideas thrown out there, and it's sort of coming back, and it's sort of being raised. I think this is going to happen. And to be fair, in another sort of similar example, we've had this whole outdoor smoking ban that Labour have suggested, and there's a number of Conservatives that have come out and argued against it, but it was only a few months ago that they were arguing to ban smoking for everyone anywhere, as long as you were born after
that never happened,
2009.
Right?
It's still going. It
could still happen.
It's in the report stage, so it didn't pass before the election. But I think Labour are
they
said
said
they're
they
going to
wanted
continue it,
yeah.
So I think it probably will still go through. But it's interesting that they're now having to sort of draw these sort of arbitrary lines between saying, oh, well, banning smoking for everyone is a health thing.
So silly.
That's a health thing, so that's legitimate. But banning people smoking outdoors is more about control, and that's wrong.
Freedom.
So it's this, they're trying to draw a line between their own smoking ban and Labour's smoking ban.
But the difference really is that they're banning young people from smoking and ever being able to smoke, and that's okay. But because they already smoke, they want to smoke outside a pub, I already get to do that. And that just feels like it's the arbitrary liberty point of I already get to do it, so therefore you're taking it away, whereas children don't already get to smoke, so therefore never letting them is less bad.
I think this is a good time, actually.
Which is so silly.
This is a good time to bring this point up as well, is that in debates like this, you really realise how much more an argument has purchase if it's already the status quo. And this is the thing with the winter fuel payments. If the winter fuel payment didn't exist, and we were discussing introducing it now, I think most people would agree that means testing would make sense.
Yeah, of course.
People, more wealthy pensioners, pensioners who own maybe 4 houses, they
probably don't need £100.
Probably don't need that. They don't need that. So some kind of means testing would make sense. But because that isn't the case, because the winter fuel payments exist and it is universal, it's a lot harder to win that argument. And we should start means testing it. Like the status quo just holds so much purchase in the UK in like political discourse, and this is a perfect example of that.
It's like if you tried to say, well, it's unfair that rich people have access to the NHS. Let's make it not universal.
Yeah,
that would not go down well.
No, but you can see that if you were to implement it fresh, that is an argument you could make. Yeah, it's interesting. It's also interesting because it's such a big debate over like. Again, obviously the people who really need it is an exception, but over a relatively small amount of money. Like we hear like young people getting slammed for like not being able to buy houses and like you should just stop buying avocados and like cancel Netflix. But we are truly talking about cancelling Netflix amounts of money here. Like £100 or £100 to £300 a year. How much does Netflix cost? Like if you're on like a premium plan, it's like £15 a month. Like the old people should just cancel Netflix. That's my advice.
I would suggest that the people who really need it probably don't have Netflix already.
Well, the same is true for young people who can't afford stuff.
They get the license fee for free though, don't they?
They do get the license fee for free.
So
you say that with a little cheeky smile there, Rory.
I was trying to bait you into...
I know, I can tell what you're all trying to do and I'm not biting.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, as I say, I think the point I'm trying to make here is that the status quo, if something already exists in the UK and you try and change it, there is so much resistance to that.
Yeah.
And I think all of the groups arguing, as I've said, about how unfair it is that it's being means tested, I think would actually advocate for it if the winter fuel payment wasn't already universal.
And those are the two big debates.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us.
It was like watching a robot buffer.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Ben and Rory for being here.
No worries.
And we'll be back again next week for more Starmergeddon.
Yeah, and posters.
Yeah, I got the poster.
Get the poster. Look at it. It took so long to make, you wouldn't even believe. It took forever.
Yeah.
Please.